This is Sunrise Sunset, the Jewish Family in Transition, and I'm Audrey Gordon. Our topic today is adolescence and suicide, something that seems to be a growing problem in our society. My guests today are Isadora Sherman, who is the District Administrator of the North Shore District of Jewish Family and Community Services. And how are you? Welcome.
Nice to meet you.
And Dr. Sherman Feinstein, who is Clinical Professor of Psychiatry at Pritzker School of Medicine and Director of Child Psychiatry Research at Michael Reese Hospital. Welcome to the show. Is it true that the suicide rate's going up for young people?
According to figures that go back a few years, the suicide rate for young people has tripled since 1950. We became particularly interested in the north suburbs when it was observed that in certain communities, it was the highest suicide in the rate for adolescents existed there.
Yeah, there was an article in Time magazine,
right,
as I recall.
Yeah, and the great concern as to what in the milieu of these communities might be responsible or in some way accounted for this rising suicidal rate. And at that point, attempted to bring it to the attention of the community through some meetings.
What did you find out was some of the contributing factors to the high suicide rate among people in an affluent suburb and adolescents especially?
Well, fairly obviously is the question of the high expectations and the high achieving goals of people who move to the suburbs, who want to raise their children in the suburbs. Certainly, these high expectations and the pressure to accomplish in a period of really diminishing options has to be a factor and is often expressed by these young people as a reason that they became so depressed.
When you and I were growing up, all of us, our parents told us that we could be President of the United States or Doctor, Lawyer, Indian Chief, and they had very high expectations for us. Was that okay because it was a society where we could achieve what it was that was necessary, and today it is not? Is that what you mean by diminishing options?
Yeah, I could really have been just about anything I wanted after World War II when I was making my separation. Although my parents during the Depression didn't tell me that I could be anything I wanted. I was lucky if I got to college. I didn't have 10 colleges to go to. It was City College, and I was glad I got there. So that may be one of the differences, that life was tougher and there was more realism and more struggle in my life to become what I became. It wasn't handed to me. My parents didn't take me to see 10 colleges, nor did I go to college with them. I had to go by myself in my own suitcase, you know. So
but isn't there, and I know that you work with young people in terms of their depressions, that's your research, isn't there a real factor here about what it is that the parents are as models that the children feel? Maybe the parents haven't ever said anything, but you know, Dad maybe went to Harvard at a time when you could get in.
Well, in a sense, if you have nothing to lose, if you grew up earlier in this century and your parents were immigrants or worked very hard to acquire professional credentials, or was very, very much an acquisition. But if you stayed at the same level as your family and business, you really had very little to lose. Your identifications growing up in an affluent community involve identifications with people who have accomplished a great deal, are very affluent, very well educated, and to be able to settle for something less than a high acquisition involves, some perception of loss. I mean, if your father is an attorney and he went to Harvard. That's a minimal goal that a kid would like to achieve. And even if he rationalizes it in very idealistic terms and becomes interested in ecology and so on, very secretly within himself, these are his goals. And we see a lot of kids who spent a few years struggling to find some sort of identity for themselves, ending up finally going to law school or medical school years later, when they finally feel that they could now, handle it, whereas earlier they were very conflicted about it. So,
is this part of the separation process that both of you have talked about? In other words, you talked about separation. Separation is a necessary function of adolescence. I think that's necessary to say. How does that take place without the kind of stress that leads to suicidal impulse?
Well, being successful, of course, is the easiest way to manage that. And then I think the parents have to really make an effort in very honest, open terms with their kids to make it, give them permission to settle for what they want to do or what they are capable of doing.
Except
and try not to create this feeling of pressure.
Except the person rather than what the person does.
Right. However, I think, and maybe Isadora can either confirm or refute this, that families don't have the influence today. As
talking about the subcultures.
Right. I think that kids essentially form their identities in a more diffuse fashion. The family is a contribution. The peer culture is another very, very important contribution. I don't think that it was that critical maybe 30, 40 years ago. In the exquisite fashion that it is today, because we see many things, from a psychiatric point of view, illnesses like anorexia nervosa, for example, and suicide, having a certain contagious factor, drug use, early sexual acting out.
Are you suggesting that suicide or suicidal gestures has a contagious quality to it among young people?
Yes, I think that there's some evidence that this can be considered an acceptable way of dealing with one's downers.
Feelings of...
Yeah.
And every adolescent has downers. Every adolescent has.
That's right. And now usually it's more in the form of the gesture that has the contagion. Killing oneself is by accident usually.
Yeah.
Unless there's a really serious.
A successful suicidal gesture is one in which you survive and you communicate the message of desperation. The unsuccessful suicidal gesture is when you accidentally kill yourself, and of course more boys than girls are successful in this way, although things are even changing there a little bit.
Well, that has to do a little bit with women's lib, I've discovered, but boys tend to mutilate themselves beyond hope, and girls tend to be more vain and passive about it, pills and things like that.
I say they're smarter.
I think it has to do with body vanity.
Yeah,
I heard that girls made more attempts, but boys were more successful because they would take a gun or they would take methods.
What they do is actually injurious to the body, whereas girls don't want to injure the body, so that they have more time to be discovered.
Yeah, but if the real purpose is to communicate one's despair, a successful gesture really does the job. If you manage to kill yourself in some macho attempt, you really lose the game.
I have heard as standard theory about why kids might commit suicide is that they lack self-esteem and self-worth that's laid down very early in a nurturing parent-child relationship. When you talked about the subcultures, you seem to indicate that perhaps even if a child had that the subculture, the peer group, could possibly still influence them to suicide. I mean, are parents going to now have to worry about the influences of their child's friends as to whether they're suicidal or not? Or is there some quirk, something that starts very early?
I think that if your self-esteem really depends on being acceptable by the group, this is not an internalized, steady state that you have, but you're still in formation as far as developing a good sense of self.
Yeah, and I think, clearly it's been stated that it is a failure in establishing early tension regulation, that usually in these children, whether they are acting out and suiciding that way, or whether they're the child who feels they can't live up to expectations and makes a conscious attempt, or whether they do it through anorexia or drug use, that generally these are kids who, if one looked very carefully into the background, there's been some failure in the early building of the ego functions of self-regulation
okay, so
and
then
so on.
That's still true, that not any child just becomes suicidal, but someone perhaps whose early development didn't receive what it needed at a critical point.
Exactly, yeah. This, of course, presents problems, and one's work would therefore have to require developing some alliance with this person and helping to rebuild some of these functions. We also feel very strongly the role of the family, and and the importance of, that somehow there has been a breakdown in communication in these families. Often they're families, not always, but in which the youngster is being used to carry a heavy load, parenting the parents. Perhaps it's the increase in single-parent families where kids are left alone more.
Is the suicide rate higher in single families?
I can't say that as a matter of fact.
Okay.
I really can't, and I don't know if you see that, but in terms of an absolute figure. But I certainly know a lot of kids are lonely, and we certainly have seen many, many more families in our caseload, which is single-parent, where kids feel the loss at this time, the adolescence. We've had, I'm thinking of several cases this winter, where the families have split, and mother is into her own, is trying to establish herself and her renewed adolescence. And that this means that she's less available, she's dealing with issues that are also the issues of the adolescent, making heterosexual adjustment again, finding a new lover or what. And these children feel very lost. It's at a time when they want to separate, but they don't want to be too fast, And they're also working on the normal mourning of the loss of their parental ties, and have expressed tremendous distress. In all the cases that I've worked with, it's usually ended up where they're feeling in some way that they are a lack of support from the family, and the inability to and the feeling that they're responsible in some way to make the parent feel better, and that it's too much.
That is too much
That it's just too much. And that in some cases, not till that really was identified, did the child stop the compulsive suicidal behavior.
What are some of the things that parents should look at? I have had my own people say, I never thought that the child was in that kind of trouble or that they would do that sort of thing. What are some of the things that people ought to look for if they suspect, or maybe even don't suspect, but something's going on in their families and their adolescents are just not happy? Are there ways of identifying a suicidal adolescent?
Well, I think that there are, it depends at what level you're talking about. I think that very clearly there are ways of identifying suicidal adolescents, because suicidal gestures are a plea for help, so that there's always a message. But I think one should think about these things in terms of some change in the personality, some withdrawal, loss of interest in school, loss of interest in friends, withdrawal from the family, an increasing sense of desperation. You know, these are some of the things that you begin to think about.
They might start giving things away.
Yes, putting the room in order when it never was before.
Right, saying, making verbal signs. This marvelous book that was just written called Vivian. It's based on the diary of a girl who committed suicide. Gave all sorts of signs to everyone, talking about needing a way out.
And really even talking about death, suicide, and just really
listening
not...
perhaps to
and just not
music that had these themes
right,
constantly.
Right, not being taken very seriously.
One of the sad things is that often this child who is seriously planning to become suicide becomes suddenly happy and relieved, and that didn't report it invariably.
Well, that's because I've heard that said. It's because they've made the decision. The agony is making the decision.
Yeah.
But once they make the decision, they become very calm. Or even after suicidal gesture is made, and you get them to treatment, they can then get this flight into health several months down the line and become very happy and peaceful and calm. But everybody thinks it's okay, and they stop watching and they stop worrying, and then that's when exactly when they do it.
Yeah.
That's kind of a critical period, I think.
Yeah. I have found that what's always worked in the cases that I've worked with is enabling the young person to talk and to open up communication with the family. Invariably, those kids don't commit suicide, even though they might do all kinds of funny things and call you in the middle of the night saying, I'm going to, Mrs. Sherman. But this is what seems to open up things. I don't know how you feel about hospitalization. I think you've had certainly more experience with this. But
well, I think it's definitely something one has to think about. Usually, the child themselves will tell you that they think they really would be more comfortable.
They don't feel safe.
That they don't feel safe. I think exactly what Isadora says is right, that once you essentially let the child know that you've gotten the message, that you really understand, how desperate they feel, and you can have a family session and they can talk about it, and the parents can react to them, that they understand the desperation. The kid will say, I didn't think you really cared, or were aware. The family's been walking, around on eggs, hoping not to disturb things and not talking about it. I think talking about it and getting it out in the open is a tremendous relief. I ask the kids, once we've established that they're feeling desperate and that I have the message, and I'll say, do you think, you might be better off in the hospital? Or the kids will come in saying, I really feel I would like to go into a hospital for a period of time. Can you arrange it? So that I think it can be used, depending on the situation. But I think you have to really examine all the elements, and you have to make a judgment. If the child is essentially very withdrawn, is really almost dehumanized objects, then you have to move. Or if the child seems to continue to make preparations, even after you have opened up communication, then you have to move.
Yeah, I think that's essentially it. You have to know
when
not to rush in automatically and send them off out of the family, which I think some people might do. I think it's a really important judgment what cases to do it, and it may mean seeing the family every day and the child, for a week or two or however it takes.
You talked before about the importance of being able to talk to the adolescent. I find that the more they'll share with you, the less likely they will to do it, especially since you're intruding in their fantasy.
Yeah.
I mean, once you can enter the fantasy doesn't have the power anymore, it seems to me, and then they have to either create new fantasies or else they have to go on talking to you, as long as you can keep the communication going. But one of the things I also hear from their friends are the sense of responsibility.
Yeah.
that so-and-so has told me that they really would like to be not here anymore. What shall I do about it? I can't tell them. They've sworn me to secrecy, and I don't feel capable. You know, they have this burden, terrible burden, when they have a suicidal friend. And what do you suggest that they do about that?
Well, I think this is where, for example, schools and so on can be enormously helpful to have essentially an availability so that a kid can come in and talk about a friend. I know many of the high schools really encourage an openness so that you know, one kid can come in and talk about a friend, and then the friend is picked up. You know, because one of the biggest missed areas is the development of a serious emotional illness right under everybody's nose and not being realized, an acute schizophrenic process that's developing.
Which shows up usually in adolescence, right?
Right. But you see, it can be, you know, a kid can become rather withdrawn, can be deep into the drug culture and be really struggling with hallucinations that nobody is aware of. Depression, manic depressive illness are dilemmas that can be very easily missed. Some of the more dramatic suicides, when you begin to look back and see what's going on, it wasn't even the psychosocial interpersonal elements were really just very thin coverings over a very serious emotional problem that was developing. But in adolescence, people sort of think about adolescence as being in turmoil and acting kooky and being withdrawn, and so they discount a lot of evidences of severe emotional problems. I think this is one thing that should be seriously thought about when you see a sudden personality change.
In other words,
a
parents
child.
having raised their kids and having seen their kids as being basically stable or normal, when they see some abrupt changes in adolescence attributed all to adolescence, and it's easier to attribute it to adolescence than to say that my child has a severe emotional disorder and perhaps I should look for that. I mean, it's easier for the parent to say, well, all adolescents, and then they go and collect all the evidence from other parents that they're having problems too.
But we should be careful not to frighten every parent that if a child goes to his room, wants to be alone, that he's going to kill himself, and that in itself becomes, you know, an over-anxiety about the child.
Well, but I'm sure you've seen it both ways. I had a family where the girl, very young girl, slashed her wrists with a razor, but not enough to be really damaging, and the mother refused to look at it as a suicidal gesture.
Well, that
I mean,
already is.
that was just for attention. I mean, I said, what does she have to do? Cut deeper next time? I mean, you know, people don't
probably that's what would
exactly.
happen.
People don't realize that even if somebody's talking about it, and talking about it a lot, or focusing on death themes or things in our culture, that those are mild suicidal gestures. And that until they get the attention they need, they may become an unsuccessful suicide, as you have said.
No, I really encourage parents who are concerned about a change in their child, and they find letters or poetry around. And you could read these things and say, well, you know, this reflects the culture and so on. But I think it's important, and I always recommend that if they're concerned about it, if they've picked up some empathic message that this child is in difficulty, they should look into it. They should confront the child. I think kids at first may be shocked about it and be a little angry about it, but I think they really appreciate it.
In other words, if this is a mother snooping around in her daughter's diary and discover something in the diary that's really scary.
The child...
I mean, the mother always says, well, how can I let her know that I was in her diary?
Yeah, this has to override confidentiality.
I tell them that I think this is part of the contract of being a parent, that snooping around is part of being a parent, and that the kids leave the thing around, and you assume that they want that it's
Yeah.
going to be picked up.
Well, I think that's part of when friends are told, is that I tell the kid who comes to me about the worry, with the worries about it, I say, they're telling you because they want to be helped. And therefore, you're not going to break the seal of friendship and of confidentiality by going quick and getting some help for them, because you can't do it by yourself. Are we seeing younger and younger suicides?
I hear reports that there are younger and younger children who are threatening. I don't know. You would know more about this. How successfully they complete suicide.
We have seen, the numbers from a statistical point of view are small, but there are definitely younger kids talking about suicide, making some kind of gestures.
Is this a contagious imitation of their elders?
It may well be. I think kids are enormously influenced by television, and they see, adult level programs at 7:30 in the evening or at 5 in the afternoon on reruns, and there's a lot of whether they even understand exactly what death is. Because from a developmental point of view, they probably don't really understand. But they talk about, they talk about, I'm going to kill myself at 5 years of age. And I think the number of gestures or successful suicides is a very low level. But there's a lot, I hear about
What about
cases
10-year-olds and 11-year-olds and 12-year-olds who are, in a sense, pushed into the rat race of adolescence before they may be developmentally ready for it? I'm talking about the society, the influence of Brooke Shields starting at 10, and models that are made to look like they're 18 when they happen to be 12.
There's a lot of I think a very important period of breakdown is around puberty. I see a lot of depressions, reactive depressions from puberty, and also the more endogenous biological types of depressions. This is the time they really begin to show up. We've begun to identify manic depressive illness for the first
time. At puberty?
At puberty. Well, our studies actually involve making the identification in childhood, but the first breakdown may well be at puberty, and it shows up in a uncharacteristic way as far as manic depressive illness is, but you see the fundamental instability with wide mood swings and periods of grandiosity and increased pressures. And so we're identifying puberty is a very critical period in a child's life, and if there's any vulnerability, they'll show it. There's a lot more drug use surfacing in the junior high schools. And
we're going to have to stop. I would love to be able to go on. We should perhaps plan another show on this. Would you say that parents should immediately get help?
Yes, I think people are so afraid of being in a position where they're going to show some weakness, that they want to work it out themselves, and maybe they'll take the kid on a trip, and maybe that will help, when really the important thing is beginning to understand what it's all about. Yeah.
Okay. I want to thank you both for coming, Isadora Sherman, Dr. Sherman Feinstein. This is Audrey Gordon, Sunrise Sunset, the Jewish Family in Transition, and thank you very much. We didn't
talk about